Hello there, John Coturillo here, the counsellor of your listener. Thank you for joining me for this episode. Today I'm going to be discussing some fallacies about counselling, psychological services and the helping professions in general that seem to be held both within the profession and outside of the profession as well. Now, before I begin, remember that what I'm about to say is not advice, so if you have concerns of any description, please seek professional advice. This is me discussing my perspectives on what I've seen in the industry, and hopefully I'll provide some material for thought that you can then use and take to inform your own research and to help you find the information you need to draw your own conclusions. There is a major stereotype, probably not helped by mainstream media and films and television programs, that counselling is just a passive process of somebody listening and validating or trying to give simple explanations for issues that are more complex, or turning everything that a client experiences into some type of mental illness and throwing pills at them to help cure them, or even just disregarding that there's anything wrong. And unfortunately, parts of that stereotype might actually have roots in reality for some people because that's the type of treatment they've experienced. In reality though, only bad counsellors do this. And there are some major misconceptions about how counselling is or should be practiced, and some of them unfortunately occur from within the industry in terms of how counselling approaches are taught. So today I'm going to be discussing my perspectives on these. There are a number of major fallacies I'd like to discuss. The first is that empathy is a passive process, that empathy is just a process of being pleasant to people, being nice for its own sake, and just sitting there smiling and nodding and telling them you know how you feel. In reality, empathy is an incredibly complex set of processes that constitute not just your thinking processes, but also your behavior and how you present yourself physically. Empathy really means, in this context, demonstrating that you can conceptualize, even if you've never experienced the client's state, what the client must be experiencing in descriptive terms and in a non-judgmental fashion. The reason we empathize isn't just because it makes the client feel pleasant. As I've stated before, when you empathize with someone, there is actually a neurological process that takes place whereby the parts of the client's brain that register when someone is behaving similarly to us become active, as do the parts of the brain that are involved in helping to keep the client calm and engaging in more complex problem solving or behaviors. What that allows them to do is calm, which allows them to think more clearly, and also through that essentially primes them to process the information that's discussed with the counsellor so that they can use that information to solve that complex problem. The empathy actually prepares their brain for undertaking the process of problem solving and change. It's a very deliberate process. The counsellor, if the counsellor is to do this well, they cannot be passive. They have to be very deliberately processing every word the client says, every gesture, their body language, and they must be, in a relatively short period of time, given it's in discussion, process it all and then understand what the key message is and what the key underlying functioning is that's implied or explicitly indicated from what the client is communicating, and then communicate that to the client in a way that not only achieves that neurological phenomenon, but also helps the client to advance their own understanding, because sometimes we don't fully grasp what's happening within us until somebody communicates it in a specific way. And a counsellor has to be very deliberate in that process. Often it involves asking a question that is prompted by what the client describes, that causes the client to advance their knowledge, because the question itself is phrased in such a way that it helps them undertake that process. That is key to progress, but it's very deliberate. Now, some people might think that counsellors are just nice to everyone, and because they're nice to everyone, it means they're showing compassion for even people who have done horrible things. Let's be clear, showing empathy to someone doesn't mean agreeing with their behaviour if they've committed a wrong. The reason we use empathy isn't just for the sake of being nice. The reason we use empathy is that without it, the client is unlikely to be in the proper psychological and neurological state to undertake the change, and without that, the process is as good as useless. If change is the goal, we must do what is safe and reasonable to help the client change, and empathy is an absolutely essential part to achieving that. Unfortunately, what can also happen is sometimes counsellors I have seen take the concept of empathy a little bit too literally and a little bit too passively. And sometimes what they do is when they empathise, they simply state back in direct terms what they've just heard the client say. Now, even that can be highly effective because, again, there is a neurological process that takes place. But what's really important in counselling that I believe needs to be made clearer in education and that needs to be practiced more commonly is what we call advanced empathy, which means not just demonstrating to the client that you've understood what they said by repeating it back in exact terms, but being able to interpret what the client has said without placing our own ideas or bias into that interpretation, being able to interpret accurately the meaning behind what people say. That way, every time we empathise, we're not only creating those conditions for change by priming them neurologically, we're also actually changing the way that they think about the issue they're experiencing. And when they're exposed to enough different perspectives on that issue, one of them is more likely to guide them to find their own answer, because ultimately that's what we want. We want the client to find their own answer so that they become a more independent problem solver and they're not becoming reliant on other people. What that also does is makes best use of the therapy time so that we're not taking too long to help the client change. We're working at a pace that's comfortable for the client, and we're not rushing the process and making them feel like the client's goals and what the client has to say isn't important. But at the same time, we're not delaying the process too much, and we're actually actively contributing to the client's progress. The next fallacy is that giving advice should never be done in counselling. Counsellors don't give advice, they just provide support so that you can form your own advice. This is somewhat complicated, and I won't say it's entirely a fallacy, it's just that sometimes this ethos is taken too literally or taken too much to heart. In many cases, it's not appropriate for a counsellor to give advice to someone else. And in every case, it is ideal that the counsellor helps the client to find their own solution, which they are willing to follow. I'll give you an example. I was actually a client of a therapist once, and I was talking about a problem that I was having at the time with somebody else. And this other person about whom I was speaking had made some sentiments towards me with which I was not particularly comfortable. And because of my trauma background, I did tend to have a tendency to people please, that is to say, to just agree with what someone else said to avoid conflict. And that's what I did in that situation. I let this person make those sentiments towards me without stating my disagreement. Now, I was talking to my therapist and I said, I think I need to approach that person and just inform them of how they made me feel. Not to confront them or attack them, just to make it obvious to them that I was hurt by what they said and I would rather that we didn't continue with those sentiments. I still wanted to be associated with that person. I just wanted to make it clear to them that what they said to me may have had an unintended effect. This therapist said, I don't think you should do that because I think the relationship you have with this person is more important to you right now. And even after I explained, look, this was part of my trauma. People pleasing was part of my trauma, and if I continue to people please, then I won't properly recover from trauma. The therapist became argumentative and said, but still, you just should have let it go. Now, this is one of those issues in which there is no clear answer, because both possible solutions, telling them how I felt or not telling them how I felt, had both strengths and weaknesses. And this is one of those situations where no one really has the wisdom to be able to predict with absolute certainty what the outcome of both was going to be. The client themselves in that situation has to make their own decision. So the proper response of the therapist wouldn't have been to give advice, it would have been to take the client through a cost-benefit analysis. In fact, sometimes it might even be appropriate to prompt the client to ask, is there a third option perhaps? I'm not suggesting there was, I'm suggesting this is a relevant question. And once we know all the options, then what are the strengths and weaknesses of each? And then encourage the client to consider which are the benefits that I would most like to receive and which consequences am I most willing to tolerate if they actualize. That type of cost-benefit analysis is a proper way to counsel someone in that situation. However, there are situations in which what is in the client's best interests is not subjective. If a client feels as though they want to express how they feel about someone else by assaulting them, then it is absolutely appropriate for me to advise that they not do that, because we know that the outcome is always going to be bad. That other person is going to get hurt and that person could find themselves prosecuted for committing a crime, so assault is not the answer. If a person is concerned about their own personal safety, I can't necessarily protect the client in all circumstances, but I can advise them to speak to law enforcement if they have concerns and to ask their advice about what they should do in certain situations. The reason being that I am not an expert on self-protection and I'm not an expert on the law. but I can direct somebody to someone who has more knowledge of that subject area than I do. If somebody is using narcotics, we know how harmful narcotics are, and while I can't force someone to stop using narcotics, I could suggest that they consider what the risks are of using and perhaps attempt to explain to them that there are benefits to not using, and whatever benefits they are getting from the narcotic usage that they could obtain by other safer means. As long as we're not placing a moral judgment on the person or trying to force them to change and telling them I won't service you unless you do what I want you to do. As long as we're not doing that, making a gentle suggestion about what is objectively in the client's best interest is not bad, as long as it's done tactfully and with a clear respect for the client's rights. In fact, if I could see that there was clearly a problem and I didn't mention it, I would actually be doing a disservice. If you care about someone, genuinely, you also want to tell them the truth to help them avoid harm to themselves. The idea that a client is the expert is an incredibly important idea, but the client is an expert on themselves. There's a lot about the client that I can't tell them, but the counsellor does have expertise on the human condition. And sometimes what is objectively in people's best interest is actually an existent idea or a possibility. And we are actually showing care by advising people that harm could come to them if they don't change. It just has to be done in a way that's sensitive and trustworthy, not judgmental or authoritarian. The problem is, it can be incredibly difficult to do that, and that's why counsellors may be too tentative. Again, anything worth doing in life is not going to be easy. It involves risk and it involves a lot of effort and careful consideration. Part of being good at counselling is no exception. It requires constant self-reflection, constantly asking myself, how can I best communicate this in a way that's not going to make the client feel hurt or judged, but at the same time communicates my genuine concern so that that client can get the best from the service and can ultimately avoid harm. Now, a related issue that can be a fallacy in some situations, it isn't as much stated explicitly as it is implied by the way I've seen some counsellors behave, is not trying to be too confident. The idea that sometimes is implied in education and professional practice is that you don't want to be too confident or too professional because you could end up intimidating the client, or you don't want to ask too many confronting questions because you could end up hurting the client in some way. Let me tell you, I've seen a lot of counsellors and psychologists essentially verbally walking on eggshells in the way that they talk to their clients and the way that they talk to me. And it's suggested in their tone of voice or their lexical patterns, and all these cues suggest, I don't want to come across as too cocky. It's certainly possible to be arrogant, and being arrogant is not something you should do in any profession. But somebody is paying you good money to teach them about how to cope and how to overcome problems. Your expertise is absolutely critical. The client will also get cues from how you present yourself. If you present yourself as arrogant, the client's going to sense it and they're not going to be happy, and they're probably not going to see your helping as particularly useful, which, as I explained before, because what you do has a lot to do with the client's mental functioning and how well they're able to solve problems, you are absolutely reliant on how well you present to the client, how comfortable they are with you. If you present as confident and knowledgeable, but also respectful of the client's right, and also acknowledging that the client is not some problem or a burden, but an individual who must be respected and heard and helped to find a solution and help to come to a conclusion rather than being lectured or dictated at, the client will appreciate that. If you come across as too passive, then the client might feel, what am I doing here? What can you possibly teach me? It is a very fine balancing act. What's also an issue is that when you are not conducting yourself confidently in, for example, your sense of dress, in your posture, in the way that you speak to the client, in the way that you convey information to them, in your willingness to sensitively, but also with a sense of determination, approach difficult concepts with the client, ask them difficult questions about, for example, what might have happened to them. What you're essentially doing is priming yourself to not be confident. If you give yourself signals that you're not being confident, according to evolutionary theory, your mind will take those signals and it will actually unconsciously engage you in a mental state that makes you less effective. And that's why I have a certain standard of formality when I consult with clients. I'm not putting myself above them. I'm not selling myself as some cold, detached, superior being and lecture at them about what they should and shouldn't do. But I do dress myself professionally, and I do engage in a professional manner, in a manner that clearly delineates that I'm at work and not socializing with my friends or my family. Why? Because not only is the client relying on me to be professional and to help them, I also need to put myself in the best possible mental state to help them. What's also an issue is that some counsellors are too scared to ask certain questions. For example, has the client experienced trauma? Or too scared to acknowledge that certain things are problematic, like, if, for example, drug use or certain types of behaviour that might actually be hurting the client or hurting other people. This is a massive fallacy. I have seen people hurt because they were not asked the right questions. I was in therapy for over a decade with different therapists, and most of them did not ask me the right questions. Only at the end of that period did I finally learn what was happening within me and how to best manage it, because somebody actually asked me the right questions. This should not be the state of the helping industry. We can't walk on eggshells. If something is going to be an issue and we know it could be harming the client, we have to be willing to sit down with the client and say, look, this may be a difficult conversation, but I can see something here that you may not see right now. I want to know if you see it, and I want to make you aware of it, because in the end, I don't want it to harm you. If the majority of people don't see that in the helping professions, there is a problem in the helping professions. Because we need to be willing to guide the client and walk with them every step of the way through that journey, no matter how difficult it is, because ultimately that's the only way that we will help the client change. And as I've said in the past, and I will continue to say it, unfortunately, this is a sign that perhaps hedonism is leaking into our professional lives. We constantly want to feel good and we want to avoid negative feelings. And so if a counsellor potentially is going to make the client uncomfortable or make themselves uncomfortable by mentioning something that is a problem or mentioning negative events, they would prefer not to. It suggests to me that all people are focused on, even helping professionals, which is quite scary, they're only focused on positive feelings. The problem is that life sometimes involves negativity and you have to face it. All the psychological evidence on coping suggests that avoidance, which is essentially what hedonism can constitute sometimes, and not wanting to engage in the struggles of life and just substituting easy alternatives that make us feel good in the short term but don't actually help us in the long term. That's what it actually constitutes. It constitutes avoidance. It's you saying, I would rather not deal with that because it makes me feel bad, without acknowledging, if I deal with this, I may actually be better in the long term. This is not a good philosophy, but I'm actually starting to see it creep into the helping professions, and it's extremely concerning for me. If you have strict professional boundaries, but you conduct yourself in a way that is professional but warm and welcoming and trustworthy, then there is a good chance your clients will trust you, and I've always found my clients trust me. Another issue that I've encountered is that of being neutral or not colluding with the client. That is to say, not being too quick to agree with the client on anything, or not showing too much emotion with them. That could also extend to not using humour and just essentially dealing with everything in a completely neutral manner without showing any emotion. If you are a complete blank slate, the likelihood is that the client is not going to see you as human. Why would a person want to talk to a machine? They want to connect with somebody human, because if you're not presenting as human, how's the client supposed to believe that you actually understand them? Do you even understand them? It's okay to show the client that you're human. As long as you're not introducing bias or taking a side on an issue in which you really don't know all the facts and can't properly make an informed decision, it's okay to show some humour or to be relatable with them. So, for example, when I worked in social services, a lot of people essentially fawn for the bureaucracy. Like when their clients complain about how complicated the bureaucracy is, how it's failed them, the workers just sit there with a blank face. And even sometimes they try to defend it. Me, I was professional, but I was also honest. If someone was upset by something that had happened in the bureaucracy that was affecting how their care was functioning, I would say, yeah, look, I know, that's a real pain to hear. I know that they're being a real pain. I'm going to do the best I can to help. Or for example, with particular clients, once I know enough about them and what interests them, what their passions are, sometimes in session with them, I might make a mild joke that references something that they enjoy in a light-hearted fashion. Of course, I know when it's going to be appropriate and I know when it's not going to be insulting to them, but it shows them I'm a human and I've actually listened to you and I acknowledge what you're experiencing. That's actually a form of communicating empathy. I can see you, I know who you are, I know what you're experiencing, and I know what your essential qualities are as a person. I'm not just sitting here listening passively. Showing that humanity helps to communicate that. Something else that people need to understand is that psychology and counselling are not necessarily general purpose titles, in the sense that just because someone calls themselves a counsellor or a psychologist doesn't mean they would necessarily claim competence in helping in all issues. And you know what? That's not bad. The mind is so complex that it may be impossible for someone to specialize in every single type of problem. That shows honesty. In some way, often a general practitioner for particular types of health issues might refer you on to a medical specialist. Now, a lot of these ideas and so-called fallacies remind us of something about life that I keep repeating. Life is a balancing act. Hard black and white rules are almost impossible to use in many situations. We have to constantly be weighing costs and benefits and making informed, careful decisions about how we respond to given situations. It's possible that some of these fallacies occur because people are not willing to take each situation on a case-by-case basis and use their critical thinking and judgment to make decisions about how to respond, so they just take a safe approach. But as we can see, sometimes that approach doesn't always actually result in desirable consequences. So thank you for joining me for this episode. As I said, please do not take what you see or hear on the internet as advice. If you have concerns, seek help from a professional. Also, I would love to hear from you. If you have an opinion on what I've discussed today, or if you'd like to join me on the show, or if you're another host and would like to collaborate with me, please feel free to contact me. But until next time, take care.